Hi, this is Lara Klick from Klick Advisors. I'm here today to talk to you about some techniques you can use in times of conflict. So, I have a phrase I like to say. I was born south of the Mason-Dixon, and that phrase is bless their hearts. And today I'd like to introduce to you a series that I have called Bless Their Hearts: How to Handle the Most Objectionable of People. So if you're ready, let's get started. In this conversation, I want to begin by talking a little bit about the phrase service recovery compared to the phrase trust recovery. This is something that makes me just a little bit crazy. So if you think about service recovery, that is the corporate phrase that many people use around the country to talk about what you do when things go wrong. So when things are going wrong, how do you recover that relationship with your customer? And the phrase service recovery has been used in hospitality and in business worlds, in places like hotels and restaurants for a very, very long time. And it was also used in healthcare when I began in the industry. But as I matured through my 30-year career, what I recognized is that when you use the phrase service recovery, there was an implication that it was a transactional interaction that you were having with that customer. And when you work in a relationship-based field where that trust bond is so vitally important, then calling something service recovery does it a disservice. Instead, what I recommend is that you shift from the phrase service recovery to the phrase trust recovery. Because really, isn't that what you're doing when friction occurs, is you're trying to go back at that situation to recover trust. And things will go wrong. That's the nature of the world. Not everything is perfect. So instead of using service recovery and having that transactional approach to fixing things that go wrong, I'm going to recommend that you shift over to trust recovery, where you're actually trying to fix a relationship more than the thing. That being said, what's the best way to handle things going wrong? Well, it's actually to avoid them going wrong in the first place. So if you're going to care about the hearts of your customer, what you have to do first is set up systems and frameworks that can create environments of success. I will tell you every single time that a system or a process is going to be essential to help the people succeed. Too often when we look at variations in our outcomes or unreliable situations, we go immediately to whose fault was that? The answer is usually the organization's. If we set people up for failure, they will meet that expectation. Instead, we have to set people up for success. So what we're going to do today is talk about our TRUST³ framework for setting relationships up for success, just like we want to set any system or process up for success. And we're going to talk about the fact that if you do not actively engage your team in learning these skill sets from day one of their employment, you're not setting that person up for success. You're setting that person up for frustration, you're setting them up for burnout, and you're setting them up to potentially be in a situation where they will be harmed. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of this conversation. So as we're blessing people's hearts, and we recognize that there are times when there are difficult situations going on, I would argue that there are very few difficult people in this world. They're out there. I've met them. After being somebody who has been yelled at for a living for almost 30 years, there is no name you can call me that I have not been called before. In point of fact, I've been hit, I've been spat upon, I've had people throw things at me, I've had people threaten my life, I've had people threaten my family members' lives. And in the face of that, I still recognize that the only person in those interactions I had the ability to control was me. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to control your responses to situations that can feel very out of control. So step one, I mentioned the best way to have trust recovery is to avoid the friction in the first place. The same is true for situations that have a high propensity to conflict. So when you look at our TRUST³ framework, the first area that we lean into is our state model. The state model is designed to have an expectation-building conversation with a customer. The state model is also designed to have expectation-building conversations with your team. And here's a little bit of a neat part of this. The state conversation can work on anyone in your life. It can work on your partner. It can work on your neighbor. The only person I don't promise that it's going to work on is your teenage daughter. I've raised one of those. I don't know that anything works on a teenage girl, but you can give it a shot. So let's talk about state, the first stage of TRUST³. So as I said, state is designed to be an expectation-building conversation. Now, why are expectation-building conversations so vitally important? There's several reasons. The first reason that they're so important is because if you're not building expectations correctly, what you have is chaos. People don't know what to expect. They create their own frameworks and they tell their own stories. And if their story is not aligned with the reality or the facts, then what you have is a situation where you'll have friction and conflict. Likewise, if somebody is climbing their ladder of inference and they are assigning their own meaning to the data sets, you very quickly can have a complete disagreement on the expected behaviors or the expected outcomes. So what you want to do is in any situation that has a propensity for friction is you want to have a state conversation from the very beginning. So what does state stand for? S in state stands with start with the common goal. So you and the person you're interacting with will have a common goal. That common goal may be to meet the customer's need. That common goal may be to have a happy marriage. That common goal may be to have an amenable relationship with a neighbor. That common goal may be to meet corporate goals and objectives with a team member. The common goal may be an environment of mutual respect with a peer. But there is a common goal that you have with the person that you're interacting with. You're not misaligned, you're aligned. The second step is you have to talk about the facts of the situation. No judgment, no values assigned, just the facts. You are pointing out the elements that you want the person you're interacting with to pick up on. So you're actually going to be sharing with them the facts that are important to you and the facts that are important to success. The next piece of that is you're going to ask for their help. Asking for the other person's participation in the relationship is vital because it gives them a sense of power and control. It also really reinforces that it's a partnership of collegiality that you're talking about, no matter what the setting. The T in state stands for tell them what's at stake. So you have to kind of do the what's in it for you conversation, and you have to tell them what the outcomes are if you're working in an aligned fashion, or what the outcomes could be if you are misaligned. And then finally, you want to express your thanks in advance for their help. That's a technique that people don't use often enough. Thank you in advance. I'm a good Catholic girl, and I was raised with a healthy dose of guilt, and a little guilt never hurt anyone. So this is your little guilt you're adding to the conversation. So you want to add in there, I want to thank you in advance for helping me, and I really appreciate that help. So state. Start with talking about the common goal. Talk about the facts of the situation. Ask for the person's help. Tell them what's at stake. And then express your thanks for their help. Let me share with you what that looks like in real life. So if I had an employee and we were getting ready to embark on a major project for the organization, we would sit down with me and the employee, we would sit down in the room and we would have a conversation about those expectations. And I would use my state model during that conversation. So it might sound something like this. Nancy, I want to go ahead and talk to you a little bit about this project. I know that you are really committed to having this department well represented. I am committed to this department being well represented in the organization as well. And together, I see great things coming for this project. What we are going to need is over the next month, we are going to progressively create a framework for success for our organization associated with training and development of our team members specific to conflict resolution. To do that, I'm going to need weekly updates with successes, struggles, barriers, so that we can ensure that you and I align for the entirety of this project, and I can remove any barriers you may experience. So every Friday, what I'm asking for is if you could please provide me with an update on status on the project plan, along with any barriers you have experienced. If we don't meet these deadlines, my concern is that it will impact our ability to have major projects like this in the future come out of this department, which will make our value seem less to the organization. Nancy, thanks in advance for your help. I have every belief that you and I are going to do great things with this project. So I've set the expectations for Nancy for the project and what I'm looking for. So our next major element of success in our TRUST³ model is when things go off the rails. So friction is going to occur. You're going to have difficult situations which arise, and there are going to be times where the initial expectation conversation is not met, or something is occurring which is outside of the expectations that have been put forth. In those moments, you're going to have to create some limits and have those hard conversations and have them early in the relationship, because you do want to have a good trust-building relationship with this individual. You're going to lean into that limit setting with caring. And so let's talk about the second element in our TRUST³ conversations where we are working with difficult situations, the caring model. So C in caring stands for connect to the common goal. We are going back to the common goal, and you may hear a theme in this because that common goal is so important, because that shows our alignment, you and I, in resolving this. We both have a desire and a will to resolve anything that is coming up. Once we reconnect to that common goal, we want to advise that person of the observed behaviors, no judgment, just observed factual behaviors and the impacts that those behaviors have had on our ability to meet the common goal. So you're going to stick with the facts here. No judgment, just facts. Next, you're going to review any previous conversations you've had. Hopefully you've had that expectation building conversation, and if so, you're going to reference back to it. If you haven't, then this may be the first of conversations that you're having to set a limit, in which case you will want to go ahead and apologize that you haven't clarified this before. Then you're going to, after you review any previous conversations, then you want to indicate what is the desired change and be specific. So if you're asking someone to do something differently, you also want to recognize that you may not have been clear in your first expectation setting conversation. So you want to get very, very clear here when you're indicating that request to change. And when you talk about the request to change, you're talking about what you do want people to do as much as possible. I'm going to share an example where you are going to have to tell someone not to do something, but how to do that as well. The N in caring stands for negotiate a solution. So if you have this conversation, you have to get curious during this conversation and identify, is this a miscommunication? Is there a barrier to success? Do they have an idea that you haven't thought about that may be a better solution than what you've thought about? And then finally, the G in caring is get help if needed. There are going to be situations where you're going to have to phone a friend. You may need to bring in another resource. You may not be clear in your communications. You have to bring in a peer to have a similar conversation. In some situations, you're going to see rapid escalation of levels of anger. You may need to get a security officer involved or bring in your experts in the building on conflict resolution. So be willing to get help if needed. And so let's go ahead, and I'm going to actually now share with you 2 different examples of what that may look like. So let's go back to Nancy. We talked about Nancy as we began, and we talked about the expectation setting conversation we had with Nancy about this major training and development project that we're working on. And then Nancy misses her Friday deadlines. So we're going to have a secondary conversation and set some limits because I've asked for an update every Friday and I have not received that from my employee. So let's go through what that caring conversation would look like. So I would say, Nancy, I know that you really want this project to succeed. I want this project to succeed as well. I have seen for the last 2 Fridays that I did not receive your update on progress and barriers so that I could facilitate resolution to any barriers you're seeing, and I don't have the information I need to be able to communicate the progress on this project to my superiors. We talked about the expectation that you were going to give me a report every Friday, and you agreed that that was a reasonable expectation. What I need you to do is by end of business today, I need you to give me the update on the last 2 weeks along with any barriers. And this Friday, my expectation is by end of business, I will have the updated progress report on this project. Is there anything at this point that you have on your plate that I need to work with you on to ensure that you have the capability of getting me those reports? Unfortunately, Nancy, because we've had this issue in the past with other projects, I do need to be open and transparent with you to let you know that I am documenting your inability to get me these things on time without this conversation occurring. And if this continues, we may have to bring in our partners from human resources to have an additional conversation. So with Nancy, I just had a pretty tough conversation with Nancy. I was very clear on the expectations. I was clear on the gaps in performance that I saw. I gave that solution to Nancy along with my expectations. I also talked about the help I would need. So if this progresses, and we'll talk about that in a few moments, to a point where we're going to have to move into a formal disciplinary process, I've been very transparent that that's something that could happen. Let's shift a little bit and use a slightly different example. Let's say that you manage a call center and someone has called into the call center and they are screaming profanity at your operators. You pick up that phone because it's been identified what's going on. Let's have a caring, limit-setting conversation with an inbound caller who is screaming and using profanity with your team, because it looks a little bit different. So we're going to start with connecting them to the common goal, because that still is where we want to start. Mrs. Jones, I can hear the anger in your voice, and I recognize your frustration. And just like you want this issue resolved, I want to resolve this issue with you. However, you have been swearing and screaming at everyone who has attempted to help you thus far. And when you're swearing and screaming at us, we're not able to move to resolution with you. As you know, our expectation is that we treat everyone with respect. We will treat you with respect, and we ask the same of you in return. So while I want to assist you, if you are unable to refrain from screaming and yelling at us, I will have no choice but to terminate this conversation until such a time that I can have a collaborative communication with you. What would you suggest that we do to try to find unity around getting you the information that you need? I'm sorry, Mrs. Jones. You've continued to scream and care at me. I do not want to do this, but I have no choice but to terminate this call. And I will be noting that I've had this conversation with you in the records. At such time, you're able to respond to me in a way which is productive. I am more than happy to talk to you again. I've set a pretty hard limit. And actually, if she was unable to change her behaviors, I have now pushed this conversation to a time where we can have that collaboration. So I moved gently into the third element of our TRUST³ framework, which is tell. So if you've had an expectation setting conversation, you've had a limit setting conversation, and now we're at the part where we've hit the hard limit. The behavior has not changed. We're in a dangerous, destructive relationship at this point. We have a situation where there is any kind of threat. We're going to move into a very, very different conversation. And that conversation is that we're going to tell them what's going on. This is that hard accountability conversation. One of the things that people struggle with, especially in caring professions where relationships are very important, is they'll live in the world of caring far, far, far too long. So they'll set a limit, and they'll set a limit, and they'll set a limit, and it'll get broken and broken and broken, and there's no consequence to those actions. And what happens when you don't follow through on the consequences you've discussed is now you actually have a relationship which is just out of control. No one is being helped. No one is meeting a common goal. You are in a free fall of chaos at that point. And a lot of times the reason that in caring professions this can feel difficult is that it's people who think they have to be nice. And they see these hard limit conversations as not nice. And the reality is you're not being nice when you're interacting with people. Nice is actually a disservice to the other person. What you want to be is kind. So when you're being kind, you're being honest. So tell is an honest conversation that is kind, and you will remain kind throughout it. You will remain respectful throughout it, but you're going to tell the truth, and you're going to set the limits because you cannot have a dangerous situation on your hands. The other thing to recognize is when you get to the point of tell, you are likely dealing with very heightened emotions. Heightened emotions can come out in different ways. For some people, the heightened emotions are very loud. They can be very confrontational. They can be very profane. For other people, when they get to that point of anger where they really are about to move towards striking out, they can withdraw very heavily. One of the things I tell people is figure out where your point of anger is. So when you're about to blow up, and I would assume all of the people watching this, at one point in your life, you've hit your limit and you've blown up. Are you someone who blows up in a loud way or a quiet way? Full transparency, I'm quiet. In fact, the quieter I am, the angrier I am. And when my kids knew that when I started getting very slow and deliberate in my statements, that I had hit my limit. And so, as I said, it's going to look different in different people. And so be very alert and ready to hear and feel where that person is. The other thing I want to share before I get into tell is you need to make sure you are safe during these interactions. Never create a situation where you are going to become a victim. So, for example, if you're in a room with someone, a tell conversation, which is going to be an intense conversation, you are always going to be the one that is closest to the door. Never put the person you're having this conversation between you and your exit. Likewise, these conversations are had at the same level as the person that you are talking to. One of the most frightening elements of my career, was back when I was working in a group home setting, is when I was seated and someone came in to confront me and they were standing over me and I was actually trapped behind a desk. It was one of the most terrifying encounters that I went through, and it took every bit of training for me to not end up being very seriously injured in that moment. The other thing is when people do escalate and they become very intense, let me let you know that your response has to actually be the opposite of how they are showing themselves. So if they yell, you get quiet. If they're very intense, you get very soft. If they're loud, you are soft. So with that opposite reaction, you can then verbally try to pull them back and down. Finally, if somebody says that they are going to injure you, if they say they are going to hurt you, they are going to kill you, they are going to punch you, they are going to stab you, whatever that may be, that is unacceptable behavior. Other signs of violence, if they throw anything, if they are pounding on anything, if they invade your personal space and you take a half of a step back and they follow you, if they point a finger in your face, those are all indications of extreme potential for violence. Those conversations you do not have alone. Get yourself to safety. Get someone else there who can assist you. Make sure you have security or police present. That is something where you need to now move into a conversation about my personal safety. It is rare, but it is real that can happen. Likewise, there will be times where someone will do or say something to you which will remove your objectivity from the conversation, that it may be in your best interest to remove yourself from the conversation. A concrete example of that, I once had someone who threatened my child. They gave me my child's full name, they gave me my home address, they gave me my child's school, and they gave me my child's elementary school address, and told me they were on a mission from God and they were going to take care of things. At that point, I could no longer be objective in that interaction. They had just threatened my child. Mama Bear was alive and well, and it was taking everything in me to stay professional in that moment. I had to go remove myself. We actually contacted the police in that situation, filed a terroristic threat report, and the next conversation with that individual was with the police. But that has only happened once in my career. I've been threatened many times in my career, and in each of those situations, I stopped the conversation, and we talked about that hard limit of, at this point, you've threatened my life. We're going to change the conversation to have that with our security officers involved. It is never okay to strike someone, to hurt someone, to threaten someone. So hear me clearly. So outside of that, and that happens rarely, but we do have to have very hard conversations sometimes with people. So I've controlled my setting. I've made sure that I'm in a setting where I am safe. I may bring in a witness for this really hard conversation because a witness is always helpful because you're going to have emotions. Don't think that you won't. We're going to talk a little bit about tell, that hard limit. So the T in tell stands for talk about the observed behavior. I am still talking behaviors. I'm not talking judgment. I'm not talking about personalities. I'm just talking about behaviors. So after you talk about the observed behavior, which is outside of acceptable guidelines, then you explain why it is dangerous, damaging, or destructive. So why is this behavior so out of bounds? You lead with empathy. Empathy is a very powerful tool, but then the final L is to let them know the consequences and then act on those consequences. So let's go back to Nancy. Nancy doesn't meet that deadline of having that report for me by end of business. The conversation I'm going to have with Nancy the next day looks a little bit different. It's going to look like this. Nancy, you didn't get me that report last night. Because I don't have that report, we are endangering our ability to meet this project deadline. I recognize that there's a lot of pressure on you to get this done in an effective way. But at this point, we're going to move into a more formal improvement plan to ensure that this is being done in the way we discussed earlier. Okay. Straightforward. I'm not going to pretty it up. I'm just going to tell them what is going on. So let me give you a couple of other examples of that with some external customers. So that person that was calling and screaming and cursing at the call center, let's say they call back and they continue to scream and curse and swear at people. I'm going to have a conversation with Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones, you are continuing to call and scream and curse at my team. At this point, you're creating an environment which is causing damage to my team's emotional well-being and is destructive to our ability to be able to meet your needs. While I recognize and appreciate your frustration with this situation, at this point, if you are unable to change your approach, I will have no choice but to formally ban your phone number's access to our call center and move all of our interactions to written interactions. Please don't make me do that. Very hard limit, very clear. Sometimes you're going to go immediately into tell when behavior goes from 0 to 60 and you're in a situation where that difficult situation is really a difficult person. It's rare, but it does happen. So somebody walks into your environment, your facility, your store, and they go up to your staff and they invade their personal space and they are screaming and pointing a finger at them. As a leader, you then see that your team is in distress and you're going to have to respond immediately. Step one is you're going to turn to someone else and say, contact the police, contact security, let's get some backup into this situation. And then to protect your team member, you may have to lean in and you're going to walk over and you're going to say, sir, I'm seeing you scream and yell at my staff and invading their personal space, and that is not okay. This is creating a dangerous environment for everyone in the store. I recognize that you're angry. At this time, I am going to ask you in no uncertain terms to step back, step away, and we will see if we can resolve this with you. Very straightforward, very firm. If you notice, my tell conversations are not flowery. They get right to the point because we are having a very real conversation at this moment. State, set the expectations, create that partnership, build the trust. Caring, set the limit. Hopefully you don't have to do that, but if you do, you are still trying to find resolution and solution. Tell, this is ending, this is out of control, this is unacceptable. This is how you handle the most difficult of situations and people who are in those situations and are not reacting in a way you or I would want to. Bless their hearts. This has been Lara Klick from Klick Advisors. I hope you found this helpful. I always take your suggestions on future content, so if you have one, please let me know. I would love to hear it. And if you need any more information, visit our website. I hope you found this valuable, and I wish you the very best. Have a wonderful day.